Hello and welcome to In the Making, a series of conversations from North Bennett Street School where we connect with a range of new voices, fields, and perspectives. Before we get into our conversation, we want to thank the many supporters that make our programs possible, including the Massachusetts Cultural Council and our partners in craft. Thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Kristen Odell. I'm an NBSS staff member and host of In the Making. We're here in Wingate Gallery at North Bennett Street School with Sarah Guerin, bootmaker and artist. Sarah studied architecture at the Rhode Island School of Design and intensive footwear at London College of Fashion's Cordwainers College. After years of training in a variety of hands-on workshops and one-on-one training with Western bootmaker Jim Covington, she established her own brand, Saboteuse, in 2015. Did I get it right?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you for being with us in person today. Sarah, we all live in the tactile world here at North Bennett Street School, and so having you and your materials here in person is clutch for this presentation. Thanks. Thank you. So let's just start with your practice.
I have a practice that has many supporting parts, and they're all really integral to each other. So I don't necessarily think that it's typical of bootmakers who tend to be traditional artists, traditional artisans who learn from someone and then make boots for people and do this throughout their lifetime. And I have learned in that tradition, but maybe because I came to it from art school, maybe because I come to it as a New Englander, I have a different, my practice presents in different ways. So it is straightforward boot making for clients where I measure your feet and I build you boots. Western cowboy boots, side seam construction is a particular way of building them for a client that we developed the design as well. So they're built for 2 feet for one body, and they're built with a design that is to that person, usually to their character, something meaningful for them. I also use my craft as art making. It's how I move through life. It's how I deal with things that are upsetting to me. That's what my art practice does for me. And I use these skills. I use these craft skills, which are slow and long and deliberate. And I make these things that are a way of art making, which are quite different from those boots, even though sometimes they look like boots. And I incorporate historical research, which sort of happened by accident and then became really, really integral to how I understand craft, how I figured out why it was so hard to get these skills that I just felt a calling to get and determinedly pursued them. The historical research answers a lot of those questions for me, and I'm constantly learning. And I talk, I'm an external thinker, so I present to the public. I do this in museums, I do it in schools, I do it in elementary schools, in colleges, and that discourse I have with people, whether it's in the moment with people like you or afterwards that start discussions that, sparked lines of thought, or maybe a puzzle piece drops into place for me from some other part of research that I've done, really helps me arm my occupational peers, the bootmakers and shoemakers and handmakers out there who all have felt the same calling to try to build a more stable future for us, because it's such a precarious craft and it's so hard to do. It takes a lifetime of dedication and it's hard to make a living at, if not impossible. So these kind of things, I'm very engaged in different communities, trying to make it better, trying to understand why it fell apart and why it kept alive in these tiny little pockets, and to make it better for the future. And part of that is not just archives, research, stories, digging into the history of Massachusetts footwear production, which really holds a lot of these clues about why it fell apart, both globally and in different regions and different places. They don't seem like obvious connections. Cowboy boots in Boston don't seem like obvious connections, but there are really deep connections that I'm discovering through archives, but I also discovered through tools. I do a lot of tool identification for museums. We have so many tools in Massachusetts in the basements of history museums and attics of people. And by identifying them and talking to these different groups, that also helps me see how the human mind worked, like why we moved away in tools and development. I started in RISD architecture, which also seems like it's not related, but my focus while I was a student was workspaces and where an artisan fits into contemporary society, whether they're obsolete or not. And so understanding how the workspaces where shoes are made, where we make boots, the different processes and the different spaces in their scales also is helping to solve this problem. And it's something that I just am constantly in process. And so all those pieces, I kind of jump between them, support each other and are really integral to each other.
Sarah, you may have just mentioned archives of shoemaking in this region. I had to step out, but can we talk about the history of shoemaking in this region and how that history influences your craft? And I just want to give some statistics for our audience. You can correct me on this. In 1905, in Lynn specifically, the shoe industry was like a $25 million industry in 1905 dollars.
Yes.
That's crazy.
Yes. I grew up in Lynn and in Swampscott, the little town right next door. This was the center of footwear development, let's say, where it exploded from a handcraft to a mechanized industrial production in the world. So wherever people are, shoes have been made forever. This is not a like, we're the capital of shoemaking type of thing, but many places love to claim. What happened in Lynn was really specific just to that time and region and the people there. So we went from this really sophisticated system of building shoes in an interconnected part, like an assembly line type of way. Women were doing many processes in the shoemaking process in their homes, to the point where they were making uppers completely first by hand, then with sewing machines, which were the first mechanized machines to influence this process. And this was everywhere. This was everywhere in the world. But what was happening in Lynn was that shoemakers were flocking to the area from Europe, mostly from Italy and England, because there was work, there was a system. And so women were doing this in homes and then in these small 2-story manufacturing buildings. And then men were taking these, whether by the women in their family or by piecework, by buying them, and taking a last, the forms around which shoes and boots are made, and turning this into a boot, doing a bottoming. So all the processes that come from then on are very heavy duty, labor intensive processes. And at first they were happening in these small workshops called 10-footers. And just Lynn was kind of, or the North Shore really was this moment, this special moment in time where we went from making shoes in homes and in these little 10-footer shoe shops, which have kind of become my obsessive focus. I work in a replica 10-footer, to this like 8-story building. This is called the Vamp Building. It's right next to the Lynn Museum. We went to this, from that to that, within like a 10-year period. So part of it was developments in architecture. Part of it's were architecture reacting to the need for bigger machines, as the human brain is like, we can make more of this, we can make more of this, we can make more of this, we can do it with this machine. They were all really tied to each other. Women were moving from their kitchens into huge factory floors, stitching. All of those developments and industry and innovative problem solving happened on the North Shore. And it kind of was like, because people were drawn there, and it just happened in that moment in time, and then was being kind of exported very quickly to other places. So United Shoe Machine Corps, 1899 was founded in Beverly, and British United Machine Corps was a subsidiary of that. So we still think of England as being like this big shoe center and industrial revolution, but that technology was coming from Lynn and going there, which, having grown up there as a child, taking field trips to the Lynn Museum, I didn't know. And I didn't know any of this until I was a professional bootmaker. And the tragedy of that disconnect is something that I am reconnecting today, healing in these ways and having these discussions, diving into these archives at the Lynn Museum, at the West Newbury Historical Society, all these places around, and finding out why. Like, why did a girl from Lynn, high school, doesn't know what to do? Okay, I'll go to art school because I'm hands-on and I need to do things with my hands. Drawn into footwear. Why did I not know that? And why was it so hard to find this stuff? And most people that want to make shoes have no idea how to go about it. Growing up here, you think you go to a school, you think you come to a place like this, and we don't have those anymore. The last school in New England closed in 1975, the Independent Industrial Shoemaking School. And I didn't know that either.
Have you arrived at a logical reason for that in your, in your history and your teaching? Have you arrived at like why did I not learn this? Why were we not taught this? Is there some, shame around that in Lynn, like environmental or anything like that?
The more that I do it, the more that I realize the complexity of the process. Like, right, we don't know that even today, if you have a sneaker, this is still an incredibly complex object, even if it's been made in factories and by mostly machines, probably 20 hands still touch that. We don't understand the complexity of it. And when it was a system that was totally dependent on all different aspects, like you were dependent on the last maker, you were dependent on the pattern makers, you were dependent on the upper makers, you were dependent on bottomers. These knowledge sets, when one dropped out, it really affected everyone. And that's sort of the story of, you know, why we have these industrial cities that are depressed now and industry left. Like one aspect dropping out and going somewhere else where it was cheaper to pay that labor. I think it's really tied to labor and the particular complexity of footwear. The more I research this, the more I think it's tied to gendered labor. 80% of footwear making is done by women. And we really developed a system here in New England. It grew where a lot of that depended on not paying women well. And as soon as women were getting more benefits and more rights, then we shipped it off to where we could pay women less somewhere else.
I'm gonna sit there because there's something on your website that is so interesting to me that you just hit on, where you talk about your work, in addition to being functional footwear, your work is an act of resistance to the systems in place that would have withheld technical skills due to your gender, or fed you bits of it to profit off of your underpaid labor.
Yes.
I want to somehow tie that into the sentiments here in our community where, you know, why do we insist on learning how to make something from the bottom up? And it kind of hits on that so that you understand the whole function of it and it's your authorship of the work.
When I was making my first studio space in my backyard in a replica 10-footer, I was really just trying to figure out my own problems. I had 3 children. I needed to be there for them. I didn't know how to go off to external employment and still take care of them. So I was trying to figure out like how to work from home and still be working. I saw these 10-footers. There are a few left and that are preserved, and thought that at this time, a shoemaker knew how to make a shoe from beginning to end, A to Z, from the very first like raw material to the finished product in a space like this. And that this was the answer, like that if I built this shop and I was working in there, then I was connecting to these things and had no idea that these processes had been so separated. The craft of today is more what I'm doing, what all the other people in the shoemaking world, hand shoemaking world, tend to be more common that they're doing it from beginning to end, which is not really historical precedent. And cowboy boots are probably the only really substantial hand making footwear craft in North America that survived. You know, in Europe it was devastated as well, but these small pockets, perhaps because it's an older place and it was just more embedded generationally, were able to survive. The youth of this country just kind of wiped out shoemaking. It certainly wiped it out in New England. But cowboy boots survived. And I think that is partly due to the scale of the workspaces. Like this ties back to 10-footers. They're small, geographically isolated workshops where the bootmakers had to know a lot more of the process. But it still was gendered labor, where this is a traditional art that is passed on from one person to another person. And women weren't part of that equation for a really long time, until the last maybe two decades, where there's really a resurgence that is helping the craft. And in some ways, I still can't articulate all these supporting pieces, but these are like key moments, and maybe somebody here today can weigh in with their experience or their thoughts, and it'll, you know, advance that thought. So my artist name is Saboteuse, and to me, this is really key to my practice, like that I'm not making a cowboy boot just for a person, and I don't mean to denigrate that at all. It's an incredibly critical, valuable part of our society to do that, but I'm making them as an act of resistance to those systems. I talk about it. I talk about these connections between workspace and tools and knowledge, and that is part of a breaking down of the way things have been in order to make something new.
Can you talk to our community about navigating the client relationship around the wanting things now, I mean, you deliberately, this is a slow make process. You've already laid that journey out, which I hope you will in a second. You'll actually
Yep.
tell us the steps. But how do you manage clients who expect things now in such a meticulous, time-intensive craft? Because our students also will be dealing with that in their careers.
So communication is key. I don't work quickly. None of us do. We can't. Part of it is just the nature of the process. When you're working with leather, you have steps that you take structural hard leathers like this that, you know, it almost has the qualities of wood, and you need to soak it in water for hours. You need to wrap it in newspaper and plastic and let it sit overnight. It's a process called casing, and until you get to a mellow state of leather, that takes time and it can't be rushed. It just can't. And you have that many times during the process of boot making. So to me, communication is key, not just saying this is going to take a really long time and, you know, I can't work quickly. It's explaining those processes. It's saying, I will explain it now. You know, we start with the last. If I'm measuring somebody's feet, I'm going to set up a last. This form is the negative space on the inside of a boot or a shoe. I'm going to set it up to reflect those 2 feet. And that takes time to do. And when you have the last, you then need to go through that mellowing process to mold this foundational piece, this insole to the last, and set it up for stitching, because these are the construction of handmade footwear is hand stitched. Everything is stitched together. There's no nails left in the product. We use them as tools to kind of tack and hold leather into place, and then they all get pulled out as you stitch it together. We do the uppers. These parts, especially in cowboy boots, can be incredibly decorative. They can be really time intensive and labor intensive. And this is directly correlated to how long it is you're going to wait for boots. So when clients, and I have that design discussion about what they want on the top of their boots, if they want something that has these like hand embroidered leaves on this one pair I have, or the longest that ever I took to make a pair of boots, it was like upwards of 250 hours, and that's spread out over a year. And that's just the decorative part. That's not the fitting of the foot halfway through the process and the building up of the last and making all these pieces. So when you're making the uppers, you are taking raw materials. You're taking these leathers that have a soft hand. It's a different kind of tannage process from the structural leathers. You're making all these pieces. I hung up some of my pieces here on the wreath. There's clicking, a lot of the cutting out of these pieces. You're turning some of them like these. This is a vamp. You're taking this flat 2-dimensional piece and putting it through a process of, it's called crimping. You stretch it over a wooden board, and this is going to take at least a day, if not 2, depending on the type of leather. And you're stretching it, letting it sit, turning it into this 3D piece that now will fit easier over a last. So if you are lasting and stretching that upper over the last, fits far more better. It's going to fit the foot. It's going to take out stretch that would require a break-in period and end up with kind of loose wrinkles on the foot. Like all these things were part of this handmade and early mass-produced mechanized processes that we've kind of simplified over time. And the average person doesn't know this. The average beginning shoemaker doesn't know this. We have no idea how complicated all these steps are until you're deep in it. And even when you can build a shoe or build a boot and you've learned these skills, it still takes 2 or 3 years to do it well. And at that point, you know, you get bitten by the bug and you want to build it well, and you want to stick with it because it's just really enriching and rewarding, and building functional objects is really enriching and rewarding. So on cowboy boots, we stitch all the upper pieces flat. After I've crimped and turned that vamp into a 3-dimensional piece, you also stitch that onto the top. You stitch, this is the counter, the part that cups the heel, and the structural part that's exposed. And I have to give a shout out to integrity of materials, because cowboy boots are one of the few footwears, whether it's handmade or factory made, where there's this integrity of structural exposed. It's like the Bauhaus of boots right here, where most shoes are like covered with the lining, and we all know that you rub that like hole through and then you see the structure through it. We stitch it all together to itself. This is the side seaming construction technique I was talking about. This particular construction developed in North America after the Civil War. So cowboy boot construction has remained virtually unchanged since the 1870s or so. And in the 1870s, we had certain machines developed in the North Shore that have been part of this process from the beginning. So while I hand stitch my soles because I want to, and I can do whatever I want, Machine stitching with these big stitching machines is actually part of the really old traditional process.
Are you referring to Jan Ernst, the?
Matzeliger.
There you go, yeah.
So he did, and I'm not, because he developed a lasting machine.
Mhm.
So
That was part of the boom of the shoe industry.
Yes.
When
it was the invention that really, you could argue the sewing machine had a huge impact, but the lasting machine, and I will explain the lasting process in a minute and a half, is really when that became mechanized. That's what the explosion in footwear production was, that virtually moved it all away from handwork.
And another example of just poor timing, he passed away before he could even see the fruits of his labor, really.
I wouldn't say it was poor timing. I would say it was structural injustice. He was a Black man who was poor, and his patents were bought up by Sidney Winslow.
Mhm.
And it's a really classic American story of a white man and a white family profiting the equivalent of billions off of a Black man who died of TB in a tenement house.
Yeah.
His ingenious inventions. And he had many. I mean, this was just kind of the most famous one. But all of these things you can look up in the archives around us. And, you know, at certain moments and times, like, he gets a nod to his contributions, but I think he's really part of a larger story as well about why these things went away too. He really struggled. So let me tell you about this process. When I showed you this becomes the upper, and at this point we last it, like you have your insole on the last, and today you would put this into a machine, a big machine that would then stretch all of this and pull it around and glue it straight to the insole. And that takes all of like 8 seconds to do. Maybe if you have a higher end shoe, you've got two, one that does the front and one that does the back, so that it's a little bit more higher quality. This was the final process in shoemaking that was done by hand with a tool called lasting pincers. And you can find these pretty much in every basement in Massachusetts. You can find a pair of these. So it's a plier. They come in different profiles, different curves, different thicknesses of the nose with a hammer attached to it. So it's both a hammer and a plier, and the hammer is used both for leverage. So it's your stretching. You really need to stretch all of this strategically and tightly and well. You're stretching using the hammer as leverage. And then when you place the leather down that you've just lasted, you put a nail in and you hammer it in. And so this process, and it has to be done in a way that took quite a bit of craft knowledge to do. And it was the final process and the final unionized hand workers too, were the hand lasters. And Jan Matzeliger was friends with many of these people. We have journals and accounts, and he really was struggling with trying to make their lives easier in a way that he also knew would make their livelihood obsolete. What happened to those men, this was gendered labor then, was that most of them became the operators on his lasting machine, because it was such a complex machine that it needed trained, like 3 to 6 months of training in order to operate the machine. And they kind of shifted from there to there. But
those machines are on display in the Lynn Museum, worth a quick train ride up there. They're pretty amazing.
So I have this old cobbler's bench here. It is actually shoemaker's bench. We called them cobbler's benches. And then in the 50s, there was this big revival of having them as coffee tables. This was the workspace in a 10-footer. So in these small buildings that were 12 by 12 feet generally, you had 6 to 8 men working in there. And this too is quite key to how things have changed over time. I work in a replica 10-footer, but I'm doing all the processes. I have sewing machines in there. I have my work table. This isn't a reenactment of old practices, because that never would have happened in those spaces. There would have been 8 of these benches, and this was your workspace. And a man would sit all day long and never move from this spot. And your lap was your work table, and all your tools were to your right if you were righty, to your left if you were lefty. And you were just doing these bottoming processes, of which there were many. So if you were lasting, you were working on your lap, sitting down, having also the leverage of your body. Your body is a really important tool in these final processes. And you'd have all your tools here, and you did everything. I mean, you lasted, you stretched this all the way around. So here you can see this boot has been lasted, and there are nails in that are just holding it as I've started to stitch by hand, stitch the construction all around. And so I'm pulling nails as I go and then stitching it all together, and then also using these wooden pegs. So these little wooden nails will also hold the leather together, because wood will expand and contract at the same rate with both perspiration from the inside of the foot and water from the outside, and hold everything together. And we had kind of developed these like really ingenious, good ways of building footwear with intent to repair, which is the primary difference between handmade shoes now and mass-produced shoes. But when we jumped, even in the time of Matzeliger, the early days of cowboy boots, which were factory-made footwear, we were making footwear with intent to repair. This is a type of construction that we moved away from in the 50s and 60s, and really moved away into a fundamental construction that is designed to fall apart. So even with cobblers, they can only do so much when the materials and the construction from the beginning was designed to fall apart.
Can I ask a question about, does that ability to repair hinge on sewing versus glue? Is that kind of the simple way to put that?
It doesn't hinge on it, but that's pretty critical. Yeah, yeah. Because there are ways of, for instance, these boots here. This is getting a little bit technical, but I'm sewing this welt strip in this particular construction. Well, then the sole will be put on, and then you stitch the sole to the welt. So if you were going to resole these boots over and over and over, you keep wearing a hole in the front, you would just cut the stitches between the welt and the sole, able to pull it off, put a new sole on, and stitch it back in those same holes. This is a cemented construction boot, so this sole is just glued on, and a cobbler can pull that off and put another sole on. But this whole, the whole upper here, just like this part, is stitched, whip stitched all the way around. So it's not quite one-to-one relationship, but the initial design from the beginning with intent to repair is the critical part of whether it's easily repairable, and the materials used. You know, we used to have leather insoles on all our shoes, and that's a long-lasting material in ways that what we now have as insoles are these compressed papers and cardboards with some synthetic materials that fall apart.
Can you talk about the physicality of your work and how prepared you were for that when you chose bootmaking as your?
It is very physical. It's hard on your hands. It's hard on your body. And I was never turned away from the work by that. I like a challenge, and I did construction. I worked in furniture. I worked in different shops, and it's not quite the same because this is like long sustained stress on your hands in particular. I do have to split and strategically do my different processes to give my hands a rest in between. And I'm aware of that. Bootmakers who make a lot of boots really do a number on their bodies that I'm not doing. And that's part of who I am, because I write a lot and I teach and I do all these other things. But it's not an easy, all bootmakers say it, let's say it this way. In the beginning, like when I first went to train with Jim, he like shook my hand and then held my hand and looked at it and said, you know, are you going to be able to do this? And all bootmakers have that story. We've all done it. We've all, I trained a woman for 2 years through the Mass Culture Council apprenticeship program, and she really had hand difficulties. It's no small thing, and it's a part of the craft. And I would never deter anyone from doing it, but I would talk about what it's like, and you know, that it requires maintenance. I have ice-shaped mitten things that I put my hands in after stitching, and it's real maintenance.
Can I also ask you a question about your overall career? You started out studying architecture at RISD. How did that guide you to shoemaking, and then how did you find this niche? Or is there any correlation, or did you just wake up one day and you're like, I'm not into architecture anymore?
No, not at all. I loved shoes. And most of us just love them, you know, I wasn't running around just saying I want to be a shoemaker when I'm 7, but I was obsessed with shoes. And I can take apart many things and figure out how they're made. And I could not do that with shoes. And that challenge was incredibly frustrating. You can't tell the order of operations from taking them apart. and I took many different kinds apart. But it was thrilling and kept me at it too. I didn't know it was something you could do. Like, I didn't know any shoemakers. Again, I was, grew up in Lynn and Swampscott and didn't know that there was that history there. We were so far from it. And while I was at RISD, I happened to be talking to a fine clothier who owned a store next to the architecture building. And just casually chatting, he said, if you could do anything in the world today, what would you do? And I was 19 into architecture. I loved the program. I loved being at RISD. And I said, I'd be a shoemaker. Just off the, when you have those moments when you just answer honestly. And he ran and got me a number of a shoemaker inside the shop because, and that was like the first moment I knew that you could do that. And I talked to this man and he basically told me that it's impossible because you can't learn the skills anymore. He had learned from his dad or his grandfather. And my takeaway was, if he did it, I can. But also, this is really depressing because I don't know where to get this education. And we grew up in a place, I don't know if your students here are like this, but we grew up in a place where I don't automatically think of apprenticeships or one-on-one transfer of knowledge as the way to learn something. I still was like, I need to find a school. For years and years, I was still looking for a school. And I eventually found Cordwainers College in London and went there thinking, finally, I'm gonna learn this. And I went and I learned a lot of pattern making. I learned how shoes are made in factories. I learned that this is your normal way of constructing, that you put it in a machine. We had the machines that are doing this, and essentially every step of that education in that footwear program was how I don't want to do things. But I also learned that I needed to find somebody who made shoes. Like all the people in there, the techs and the teachers were like, what you want is bespoke shoemaking. And I didn't know what that was. And these are the disconnects that I keep trying to just share with as many people as possible. Just talk to different publics, just talk to people in the street and say, hey, this is a thing. Look at your shoes. Somebody made them, whether they're in a factory and it was 10 different people, or whether it's a high-end shoemaker in Pennsylvania, like the phone number I got that day.
I want to ask about collaboration. So you say that your clients become collaborative co-authors in the boots that you're making for them. So I want to talk about that, but also what types of craftspeople do you collaborate ever in your work, or have you?
I am like doing things by myself to a fault. So as far as the making part, I don't collaborate often enough with other people. I brought a couple examples of things. Yes, my clients are absolute collaborators. So I did want to pull this history into it a bit. I had someone who is a stove repairman, and he wanted the fire theme from these cast iron stoves on his boots from the 1800s. And this launched me into this like mold making and making all these pieces in order to put the fire theme on his boot, this is kind of a messy pancake boot, but the working out of the decorative parts is a collaboration, right? Like none of that would have happened without him. But then I met a painter, Mary O'Malley, who is the one who designed this graphic, these flowers. And she paints on paper, she paints with paints, but she is a natural boot designer. And I'm not drawn to doing the abstraction of floral things, which is part of the practice of Western boots. So for my demo to, toot her horn about how amazing she is, I used her work for that. So that's a form of collaboration.
Is that painted or leather?
This is leather inlay. So this is which you probably have here in bookbinding, where you cut a hole and back it with another piece of leather behind and then stitch it together with a lining to hold it all together. I had a grant in Boston during the pandemic where they paired artists. They paired artists who did really different disciplines together, and I was paired with a muralist and a painter. And so I made the biggest boots that I could possibly make, and he painted them. And he has the other boot, Mercabelli, from the South Shore. So that was the type of collaboration that also made something that I never would have made on my own. That was really kind of rewarding, but it's difficult. There's more shoemakers and bootmakers right now in Massachusetts than there have been in decades, because there is kind of this resurgence of knowledge and knowledge sharing and people being able to do this. Daphne Board is out in Western Mass making shoes by hand. but it's hard to collaborate when it's such a specific and rare skill set.
The boot with the masonry symbol, the stone symbol that you molded, the one that the pancake, yes.
This one? Yeah.
Do you are you making a full prototype before you're making the final?
Early on, I did. Early
Wow.
on, I made 3 boots because I wasn't confident in the fitting skills. So, and I mean, like we all do in our craft, and I'm quite a meticulous crafts person. Every time I do something for the first time, it's not going to be as good as just the second time I do it, it's just that much better. So early in my practice, I mean, up until maybe 2019, I was doing 3 boots. And I would get out all the messiness and then I just got much better at what I do, and I don't do that anymore. Yeah.
It seems like a lot.
And it's hard to have 3 lasts, right? So
Yeah.
you have a left and a right lasts, and I have to find a close third, but
I have a ridiculous question about the boot, Western boots themselves. Are they comfortable?
yes, they should be.
And they should be because they're bespoke, they're made to fit your foot shape.
Yep.
Okay, the second question is how tricky is it in your career to make sure people understand that? You know, that, and also to understand that, you know, it's just like any new high quality shoe, there's you kind of got to work through it a little bit, and then it's there forever.
Well, I talk about the construction, right? Like, because we don't know these things, but a cowboy boot has this sad reputation for being uncomfortable because of certain characteristics of that type of footwear. So it's the last. The last needs to represent your foot. Of course, the best case scenario is having a custom boot maker measure your feet and making them exactly reflect your foot. But different companies, if you're buying boots from a big company that were made in a factory, they have their own set of lasts, and perhaps the design of where certain volumes are on the last of this company fits your foot better. But a lot of them don't for certain reasons. So having a pointy toe, people associate with being uncomfortable. But if a pointy toe is done well and correctly, where it starts to taper off is in advance of certain metatarsals on your foot, it's just aesthetic. It should have no effect on how comfortable or uncomfortable it is. The problem with that is that so many factory lasts, because in fashion, we think smaller feet look nicer, have pulled that back to make the foot look smaller, and then it's cutting into your bone movement of the foot in motion and hurts it. Even though they look straightforward and simple, they are not. They're one of the most complicated forms of footwear you can make, because you have to have this critical measurement right here from the base of the seat to right here called the short heel, that is big enough to pull on your foot and tight enough to hold it onto your foot in motion. And that last design is going to reflect whether it does it well or not for your foot. And it only hits about 40% of the general population's feet. So whereas shoes with laces are much easier to fit a wide variety of feet, because you can loosen them or tighten them. And a pull-on boot, whether it's a motorcycle boot or a cowboy boot or an equestrian boot, can't do that. And so these are things, because of those constructions, that I just try to explain to people. I invite people into my shop. I do these kind of things. I'm trying to get artist residencies where I work in public more and just talk to lay people walking by and tell them these things. And the more that people understand and go home and say, hey, I saw this bootmaker and it was wild, I never knew this stuff, like the better it is for our craft, but also for people and their feet, like understanding these things as consumers.
It's similar to what our furniture makers navigate here, is just educating the masses on the quality of investing once in something really, that will last you generations.
Yeah.
While I'm talking, I just want to invite our virtual guests to ask your questions. Type them in the chat box and I'll read them up to Sarah. And I hope I didn't miss this, but did you tell us about where your lasts are made? Are you making those, and how are they made?
I didn't. So a last is to a right and a left foot, and then, the specific sides and specific characteristics, but they also do have design in them. Like I can measure your feet and have a last that looks like a cowboy boot, a last that looks like a Birkenstock, a last that looks like a sneaker. and have the same kind of information. It's just the volumes are shifted around. So because cowboy boots have such a iconographic silhouette, we mostly use either reproductions of historic glass or actually find historic glass. I bought these off of eBay and I use them for my demos because they're much skinnier than most feet today. But I could find lats that are close to somebody's feet. It's not easy. And this is one of those examples of like a key part of the entire system falling out, right? Like we have lost last making knowledge for the most part. There are a few people in England and Germany who still kind of have a robust knowledge set and have companies that produce lasts. But for the most part, I buy them from a bootmaker in Oklahoma who is getting reproductions of like older lasts, and then I adjust them. I measure your feet, I add and glue, like this one's been adjusted with little bits of leather onto it, and then you shave away. I've taken last making workshops, and frankly, like my sculpture classes at RISD really helped understand having to sculpt hands and feet, understanding those structures and the bones and the tendons and how they move. A last is really a foot in motion. It's not just a foot. Like if you cast your foot and then try to make a shoe around it, it wouldn't work because it has to have space in certain areas of when your foot is going through the gate. So that's what I do.
Thank you. Can you talk to us about how you have a 10 by 10 at your home where you do your work? And so going at your work from that direction, you're setting your life up sort of, or you're setting your business up around to make it work with your life.
Yes.
Can you speak to that at all?
Yes.
I mean, why is that important?
So most shoemakers and bootmakers who do what I do work in isolation, and that's to the detriment of our craft, right? Like the internet has been incredible in connecting us, especially through Instagram, because we're able to have the kind of communication and interactions that just didn't happen before unless you were in a workspace with other people. So I joined it thinking I would just get my work out there and never expected to find this like really, really deep and meaningful footwear making community that's far spread everywhere. And we help each other out. We're not so isolated. It doesn't mean I don't get lonely in my shop though. I'm a people person. So that's another reason I do a lot of these things. It's just to get out and interact with other people. But it did work for me for my life. I had my 3 children, my husband's in the military and leave for a year. And so I had to be present and I could kind of move more fluidly between my home and my workshop. Because of that having that need, it really drove a lot of my research, which then just was like a rabbit hole of information and thought-provoking things that I never expected either. I was on the planning board in my town and knew that it was a use violation. Nobody really cared there. But it's one of those examples of like something being fundamentally wrong. It shows the values of your zoning, shows the values of your community. And that launched my 10-footer research because I started digging into these archives to use them as a defense of changing our zoning. And we did. I rewrote the zoning law and we have this art and craft accessory use now in Wakefield for the zoning nerds.
Well done.
But it's important. I mean, it shows your values, like it shows that connection to history. And this wasn't something that happened across the Northeast to crush artists and artisans. It's something that happened unintentionally as we moved away from thinking of what we do here as a way to make a living, as a way to exist and move through the world. I want to jump back a little to your question before. When I was at RISD in architecture, the more I moved through that program, the more I knew I didn't want to be an architect, but the education was so pertinent to what I was doing. I do that with bootmaking, the same processes and the same development of design and ideas and tying in construction to design. But I at the time kept thinking architecture is too big a scale and this is my scale. I need to work at a hand scale. But as time kept passing and I do what I do in my practice, I realized architecture was actually the middle scale. I work at this scale in order to understand the macro scale and try to change that. This is what I am using this to actively change something at a macro scale. And architecture just felt like in the middle scale of it, which is new for me to be able to articulate, but I think exciting and important.
Yeah, that's great. That's like how the students learn in these programs, you know, you're learning this through this method that you could then take really to anything and apply it, you know, the steps. Get to your dovetails and your big piece of furniture, you know, that whole scale. I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, and so something about NBS that I love is that you would have those social media, like share a tool, and it would be generally like people were sharing tools for the programs that you have here, and I would share shoemaking tools every time, like, oh, pick my hammer that I got at Brimfield, and I was so excited to find this very specific shoemaking hammer. And then sharing like once a year, I think on your anniversary, you share these old pictures of students here. And there was once I dug through Facebook and couldn't find it, but there was once a picture of a student repairing a shoe. So there was a shoe, there must have been a shoe repair program here, and somebody wrote shoemaking, and I knew it wasn't shoemaking because of my knowledge that it is unusual, that it was repair, and this is why, and these are the tools, and there's a call for shoe repair education. I was just at this conference in New York of shoemakers and cobblers who are the repair people, and consumers who buy high-end, not custom bespoke, but really high-end factory made shoes and boots. And there are too few cobblers for that. But part of the problem too is that our everyday shoes, our much more common shoes are not repairable because of those materials. But there's some like little germ that's generating, or that maybe we can bring that kind of education back in a new way that reflects the footwear at a place like this in a more systemic way than is happening now, because cobblers are learning from other cobblers now. They're not learning in trade schools anymore, or schools that are preserving craft.
Yeah, it's just passed down information.
Yeah.
Well, if anyone's gonna do it, it's going to be you.
Well, I think I'm not a repaired person. I mean, these are two very distinct skill sets, and
so share with us your best or favorite or most used tool.
so my hands,
Yeah.
without a doubt, but the tools that are married to my hands, I'm not a collector of tools. A lot of footwear makers are, you know, they love them, they fill their houses with them. I'm constantly like passing them off. I'm finding the ones that fit my hands. But this little bone handled channel opener tool fits my hand perfectly. A lot of the making tools, those processes that men were doing in 10-footers, are too big for women's hands. So it's really an issue and exciting when you find them that do. My lip knife, which is a very specific profile and shape for certain parts of cutting in the process, also fits my hand really well on my fingers. And this is my wife in shoemaking. Classic shoemaking knives were. Afterwards, I invite everybody to come touch any of the tools except for my knives, please, so you don't get hurt. But a classic shoemaking knife kind of had a curve on this way and then a curve on this way. And it took a really long time of using old tools, some new ones, to move to almost all my tools are with this Japanese style knife. And this I think is really important because a lot of shoemakers and bootmakers are also moving to this tool that does things that you hold it in different ways with your hands, so you're not always putting the same stress on your hand in the way that you can't really hold this knife in different ways. You're always holding it the same way. So the stress on your hand in one position over years and years and years is going to be different than using this type of knife. But this is a communication among craftspeople that I don't think was happening before Instagram. That is truly affecting our profession and our craft and our bodies.
What do you mean a communication that's happening?
Because this is a tool that would have been used in Japan, and it's not that nobody knew that because we were separate, but nobody knew it, or too few people knew it in a really distinct small subset of craft like shoemaking and bootmaking that we started sharing. This one actually comes from England. So Barnsley was this old tool maker in England, started making them in this style. And just a sharing of knowledge, a sharing of skills that is keeping those things alive in a way that wasn't before social media. And then that hammer, this is, you know, I sort of joking about it, but not really. It has a big flat head and then this kind of cylindrical tall head here on that side that is really specific to one part in boot making. So on this demo piece, I've started to sole the boot and I started to show it being stitched. But this area of the shank is really such a tight organic form. When you're doing the soling, you want it to be as pristine as possible. And this hammer does that. Like this hammer has that vertical part for hammering in the shank area without leaving any divots of the hammer and having it be aligned to the shape. And then the big flat head is for the forepart, so that when you're adhering all this together and shaping it and molding it, you're doing that without leaving any kind of mark. And this was something, level of quality and craft to the product you were producing was reflected by your tools at a certain moment in time. And this tool is probably 100 years old and we don't have necessarily any use for it. And when I bought it, the guy selling it to me had no idea what it was for. It was just so, going through these tool collections, talking to other makers, finding the things that I find really elevates what I'm able to do. And also gives me insight onto how things were done before.
Oh, great. What, one last question for me. What is the bone, the miscellaneous bone in your?
So the bone, so I'll do two things. So I do a lot of presentations to elementary schools too, because I want to never have another third grade girl or boy coming out of Massachusetts school not knowing how shoes were made or that you could be a shoemaker. And these are the two hands down favorite tools that for kids every time. A deer leg bone is a critical tool for burnishing the leather when it's mellow, when it's hot, and you rub it against it, you compress all those fibers. And I use it in different ways throughout the process. I dropped this one on the floor in my shop and it broke. And this is, hilarious to children that I broke my leg. And, but it actually like broke in a way that made this like extra tool that I use in other ways that I wasn't expecting. So that's my deer leg bone. And then the way when you sew really heavy, thick leather, it's not like fabric, sewing fabric. So you have to punch a hole ahead of time with an awl. I have different sets of awls, and then you're guiding the threads through those holes. Traditionally, it was done with this, which is a boar bristle, a hair from the back of a pig, and it attaches to the threads, and we attach it to the thread, and then just guide it through the hole. And it worked really well because it's flexible. It's made out of keratin, I think, like our fingernails. This is a skill set of how to attach it that has all but disappeared, except among this very elite group of shoe and boot makers. I don't do it very well. I've tried, and I moved away from that to guitar strings. I solder guitar strings and use them sort of as big-eyed needles. But the fact that these wild pig hairs were part of that process is always also really intriguing to people all over, but especially kids that, I've had like third graders ask me if there are wild pigs running around Stoneham.
I think it's more intriguing that you use guitar strings.
Yeah, that works for me. The people in this craft have found a few different solutions to this. Fishing wire is one. They still do the same processes of attaching the thread or the waxed end, it's called, to the end of the fishing line and use it essentially in the same way. I like the boot maker that I trained with used needles, actual needles, and had heated them up and bent them because they need to be curved. I really like the guitar string. I experimented with 5 different gauges of steel string and how to solder them and how to do it consistently. I've got it down. It's part of my practice and I like it. I can bend them, shape them for different curves and very easily, and it works for me, and that's what I do.
Great.
It's not, I don't do very deliberately, I'm not doing a replication of an old process. Like there are people who overlap with my world for sure who do that, like that keep knowledge that's alive by doing demonstrations in museums of this is how a shoe was done in 1850. This is how a shoe was done in colonial Williamsburg or something. I am a living artisan, and so I am able to do or not do whatever it is that I want, but I really feel strongly that I should say why. Like, this is what works for me, this is why, and I'm not being limited by trying to replicate something that happened in the past. Like, we are all part of this human story of innovation, and so many parts of this craft are important, like why these tools are good and why they elevate the craft. But I don't know, it's a hard thing to just say like, this is how I'm doing it and, live with it and share it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We'll wrap there. I just want to thank our virtual audience for being with us today. Thank you, Sarah, for giving your time.
Yeah.
And I wish you all were here so you could come and feel all of these samples that we all will be when this ends. And thank you, and we'll see you soon in January. Thanks so much. Take care.